It took less than 10 minutes for J.D. Vance to expose the secret Kamala Harris had fought so hard to bury, a truth so explosive it unfolded live, before a nation holding its breath. The cameras rolled, the stage lights burned bright, and in that fleeting moment, millions watched as words became weapons and a career hung by a thread. What hidden deal could ignite such fury, such shock, that even the vice president herself seemed to falter under its weight? Now we step inside that moment, not as it was, but as it might have been. This is a dramatized retelling, inspired by the real hopes, fears, and questions that live in the hearts of Americans. The events may be imagined, but the feelings they awaken and the truths they ask us to face are very much real. Now let's return to that night and witness what unfolded when the truth refused to stay buried. What happened next would leave a nation questioning everything it thought it knew. Let's begin. The air inside the CNN debate hall seemed electric, alive with a kind of charged expectancy that only comes when the stakes are too high to name aloud. Across millions of living rooms, Americans sat forward in their chairs, hands loosely clenched around coffee mugs or the arms of worn recliners, as if their grip might steady the nation itself for what was about to unfold. At center stage stood Pete Buttigieg, bathed in the white-hot focus of the national spotlight. His suit was flawless, his tie a sharp line of Navy precision, his smile polished but not forced. He radiated confidence, not the kind that shouts or boasts, but the kind that quietly dares you to doubt him. His voice, when he began to speak, was smooth and measured, each word deliberate, each promise wrapped in certainty. "This is not just about bridges and roads," Pete began, his eyes sweeping the studio and, by extension, the country beyond. "It's about restoring dignity to American labor. It's about families who deserve to see their towns thrive again. It's about jobs that can't be outsourced and futures that can't be bought and sold to the highest bidder overseas." The words landed with the weight of hope. Applause erupted in pockets across the audience, but Pete barely paused. His rhythm was too carefully set, too intentional. He painted a picture of renewal, steel rising again in Rust Belt towns, schools rebuilt with union labor, highways that didn't just connect cities, but reconnected people to opportunity. And as he spoke, something fascinating began to happen. The room and even the television audience beyond it seemed to lean in. This wasn't just policy, it was promise. The promise of an America reborn, not in fiery rhetoric, but in asphalt and girders and paychecks that stayed home. Yet beneath that polished surface, just out of reach of the cameras and applause, there were other energies at play. The journalists lined along the stage's edge exchanged subtle glances, some tapping notes into their devices with fingers that moved a little too fast, as if anticipating something more. In the control rooms of rival networks, producers barked quiet orders. "Keep him tight on camera 3, something's coming." And Pete, whether he sensed it or not, kept going, layering detail on detail, vision on vision. "In my plan," he continued, voice warming with conviction, "we're investing $1.2 trillion into infrastructure over the next decade. Real money, real jobs. That's over 2 million new positions for hardworking Americans. Electric grids modernized, broadband extended to the forgotten corners of our country. Rail lines that will finally bring this nation into the 21st century." The numbers rang out like a challenge to any who doubted him. But with every stat, every bold projection, the question began to rise unspoken in the minds of those watching. Could it really be that simple? Could anyone plan, any one politician, promise so much and deliver? And in that question, subtle but growing, was the first crack in the smooth surface of Pete's moment. J.D. Vance, seated just out of frame, listened in silence, his expression unreadable. But in his stillness there was a quiet storm gathering, a wait to the pause before action. Viewers couldn't see him yet, but they would. And when they did, what unfolded next would not be forgotten. Somewhere deep in the gut of the nation, a tension had begun to hum. Not loud, not yet, but enough that those watching, knowingly or not, found themselves unable to look away. The night had only just begun, but already everything was on the verge of change. But as Pete Buttigieg's words echoed with promise, As the applause settled into that brief, expectant silence before the next polished phrase, the moment cracked open. J.D. Vance shifted forward, not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet certainty that drew the eyes of everyone in the room before he even spoke. The cameras, trained instinctively on Pete's confident stance, hesitated, then widened to frame this unexpected shift. The energy changed, almost imperceptibly at first, like the air thickening before a storm. "Before we continue," J.D. said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that sliced through the polished atmosphere, "I think the American people deserve the full picture tonight." His tone wasn't raised. There was no anger, no bluster. And somehow that made it more arresting. The room seemed to shrink around him, the audience holding its collective breath, leaning in toward what they could feel, without yet knowing, would matter. Pete froze for the briefest moment, the practiced ease of his expression flickering at the edges. But J.D. was already moving forward, his hands steady as he placed a small device on the podium, a recorder, its blinking light suddenly the most ominous thing on stage. "This," J.D. continued, "is audio from a meeting that took place just last month. A meeting where Mr. Buttigieg and representatives of foreign corporations discussed tax breaks, incentives, and contracts that would ship American jobs overseas. The same jobs he's promising to protect tonight." Gasps rippled through the studio, soft at first, then sharper as the weight of the words settled. The moderator's eyes widened, fingers twitching toward his notes, as if searching for a script that no longer applied. Pete's face paled, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came. Not yet. J.D. pressed play, and in that instant, the room filled not with the polished rhetoric of debate, but with the grainy, undeniable sound of Pete's own voice, familiar but stripped of its public sheen. The audio crackled faintly, then grew clearer. "We can structure the incentives so that the production shift appears gradual. The headlines will focus on job creation here, but the long-term efficiencies will come from the overseas facilities." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Pete's eyes darted briefly toward the moderator, then the crowd, as if searching for some anchor, some way to steady himself against the tide that was rising fast. The audience sat in stunned silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the recording as it continued to play, revealing more. Discussions of tax shelters, phrases like acceptable collateral damage, and promises of discretion that now echoed with bitter irony. J.D. said nothing further. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than outrage might have. The revelation had landed, and as the recording ended, the tension remained, a vacuum of sound and breath and certainty that had, only moments before, seemed unshakable. Pete tried to gather himself, but his voice, when it finally came, was small, almost lost in the storm now, swirling through the hall and across the country. And so, the night that had begun with promises of renewal shifted irreversibly. The quiet storm that had gathered behind J.D.'s stillness had broken wide open, leaving no one untouched. The truth, or at least a piece of it, was no longer hidden. And the audience, both in the studio and across millions of screens, knew instinctively. This was only the beginning. The ground beneath the polished stage had started to shift, and what came next would demand their full attention. For a breathless beat after the final hiss of the recording faded, the room seemed frozen in time. It was as if the air itself refused to move, too heavy with the weight of what had just been laid bare. Then all at once the spell broke. The studio erupted, not in applause or jeers, but in the jagged, discordant hum of confusion, disbelief, and rising voices. Reporters leapt to their feet, some shouting questions that tangled over one another and dissolved into noise. The moderator's carefully rehearsed composure cracked. His voice faltered as he tried and failed to restore order. Pete Buttigieg stood at his podium, hands gripping its edges so tightly that the blood seemed to drain from his fingers. His polished confidence, the ease that had carried him so surely through the first part of the debate, had vanished, replaced by a pale, tense uncertainty that even the harsh stage lights couldn't conceal. He opened his mouth once, twice, but the words refused to come, caught between instinct and calculation, shame and defiance. His gaze flicked toward J.D. Vance, searching perhaps for a clue to the next move, but JD offered none. JD Vance remained still, his posture composed, his face a mask of quiet resolve. He didn't gloat. He didn't gesture to the crowd or the cameras. Instead, he let the truth he'd revealed speak in the silence he left behind. Without a word, he stepped back from the podium, his exit as controlled as his entrance had been. As JD turned and began to leave the stage, his figure briefly framed by the bright white of the spotlight, the room seemed, for an instant, to tilt toward him, as if the gravity of the moment belonged to him now, not to Pete, not to the promises that had filled the air so confidently only moments before. Behind him, the chaos deepened. Producers barked orders through headsets, gesturing frantically to camera operators who struggled to decide where to focus. On Pete's faltering attempts to recover, on JD's retreating form, or on the bewildered faces of an audience that had come expecting a debate and found themselves witness to something far more raw and consequential. The tension crackled through the wires and monitors, spreading beyond the studio walls to the living rooms of a nation now leaning forward, hearts pounding, unwilling to miss what would happen next. Pete tried again to speak, the words rough at first, like stones in his throat. This isn't what it seems, he began, voice straining to rise above the noise. But even as he spoke, it was clear that whatever reassurance he might offer was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it had taken root fast. His statement sounded hollow now, thin against the echo of his own recorded voice, still ringing in the minds of those who had heard it. The chapter closed with the image of JD disappearing into the wings, the cameras struggling to follow, the audience torn between the man who had once commanded their trust and the one who had, in the space of minutes, shattered it. And as the moderator's voice cracked through the din, pleading for calm, the last thought hanging in the air was not of infrastructure or promises, but of what else might be waiting in the shadows, what other truths might yet come to light before the night was done. The stage was set. The storm had only just begun. The storm that had erupted on stage didn't end when the cameras cut to commercial. It followed Pete Buttigieg like a shadow as he strode off, his steps brisk, his breath shallow, his heart pounding loud enough in his ears to drown out the confused murmur of production staff scrambling to adjust to the chaos. The corridors behind the stage, usually a place of calm coordination, had become a hive of frantic motion. Aides barked into headsets, trying to control a narrative already slipping through their fingers. Every screen Pete passed replayed the same devastating moment. JD Vance standing tall, the damning recording playing for all of America to hear, Pete's own voice sealing the damage with each phrase. He pushed through the door into the campaign's private staging area, the room snapping into silence as his team turned to face him. For a second, no one spoke. Then it broke. Sharp, overlapping voices, urgent and raw. "What the hell just happened out there?" one advisor demanded, voice tight with panic. "How did we not see this coming?" "You need to get out there and take control of this, now," another urged, eyes wide, gesturing wildly toward the stage as if Pete might simply march back and undo the damage. Pete raised his hands to quiet them, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt dry, constricted, as if the weight of what had just happened was physically pressing down on him. The room seemed to close in, the walls too close, the air too thin. "Who leaked it?" Pete finally managed, the question more accusation than inquiry. His voice, usually so steady, cracked at the edges. "Who in this room failed me?" A hush fell, but only for a moment. The senior strategist, a woman who'd been with him since the start of his national rise, stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "This isn't about who leaked it, Pete. It's about how we survive it. We can't waste time pointing fingers." "Don't lecture me," Pete snapped, the anger flashing now, his composure fraying with every passing second. "Don't you dare stand there and act like this is some normal crisis. That recording—" He stopped himself, chest heaving, realizing too late that his outburst had only deepened the cracks forming among his team. "We warned you," another aide muttered under his breath, not quite softly enough. Pete's eyes shot to him, fury mingling with something else. Fear, maybe, or the sinking knowledge that the foundation he'd so carefully built was crumbling beneath him. "You warned me?" Pete echoed, voice rising. "About what?" About fighting for American jobs? About making deals to keep this campaign alive? The words tumbled out, too fast, too loud, as if volume might cover the tremor of doubt now coursing through him. The room grew more chaotic, voices clashing again, the once united team splintering under the pressure. Accusations, defenses, desperate strategies filled the air, but nothing stuck. Pete heard them, but only distantly, as if submerged beneath the noise. His mind raced, replaying the sound of his own voice from that recording. The phrases he'd thought safely buried, now weaponized against him. And as the arguments raged on, Pete felt a hollow certainty settle in his gut. Whatever came next, nothing would be the same. The night had turned against him, and the ripples of that single shocking moment were only just beginning to spread. While chaos consumed the backstage corridors and Pete Buttigieg's team fractured under the weight of the revelation, J.D. Vance stepped into the night, away from the glaring studio lights, the noise, the storm he had just unleashed. The cool air hit his face like a balm, sharp and bracing, grounding him in the reality of what he had done. He kept walking, slow and steady, past the media vans, past aides scurrying in frantic clusters, past the edge of the debate's controlled chaos. He needed space, space to think, to breathe, to reckon with the magnitude of the moment. He hadn't spoken another word after the recording played. There had been no need. The truth, once released, had its own force. But now, with the night pressing close and silence settling around him, J.D. felt the weight of that truth in his bones. He knew there would be those who called it a political move, a calculated ambush, a ruthless play for headlines. But in his heart, J.D. understood it had been something else entirely, something far older, far deeper. His boots crunched on the gravel as he came to a stop near the edge of the lot, where the distant hum of traffic filled the air like a low drum beat. And in that stillness, memory surfaced, clearer now than the noise he'd just left behind. He saw his father's hands, rough and calloused from decades in the mills, the grease that no soap could ever truly wash away. He heard again the quiet despair in his mother's voice the night the factory shut its doors for good, the night the last paycheck came, the night the future they'd believed in crumbled into uncertainty. J.D. closed his eyes, letting those memories steady him. He saw the faces of men and women he'd grown up with, men and women who had worked hard, played by the rules, given everything they had, and been left with nothing when the plants closed, when the jobs went overseas, when promises made in campaign speeches turned to ash. That was the truth he carried. That was the truth that had compelled him tonight. He could still feel the small recorder in his hand. The moment he'd set it down, the silence that had followed. It hadn't been a choice made lightly. He'd known the cost, known the storm it would unleash, but he'd also known that silence served no one. Not anymore. Not when families were being hollowed out. Not when entire towns were dying slow deaths in the shadows of abandoned factories. In the distance, the studio's floodlights cast a faint glow against the night sky. J.D. stared at them, at the place he had just left behind. There would be fallout. He would be called ruthless, opportunistic, divisive. But he could live with that. What he could not live with was standing silent while leaders sold illusions to desperate people. His voice had been calm on that stage, but inside his heart had burned with the memory of those he'd promised himself never to forget. The night felt heavy with what came next, and J.D. knew the storm wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for now, in this brief pocket of quiet, he allowed himself one last thought. Simple, unvarnished, true. This wasn't about him. It never had been. The people he fought for deserved better. And tonight, in front of a nation, he had chosen to speak the truth they'd waited too long to hear. The night's storm didn't stay confined to the debate stage or the tense corridors behind it. As J.D. Vance stood in quiet reflection beneath the glow of the studio's floodlights, the shockwave of what had happened rippled outward, faster and harder than even he had imagined. Within minutes, newsrooms lit up coast to coast, screens filled with split shots, Pete Buttigieg's pale face frozen mid-expression, J.D.'s recorder resting on the podium like a relic of truth, the stunned faces of the audience caught off guard by the night's dramatic turn. Cable networks cut away from analysis mid-sentence as anchors scrambled to adjust to the breaking narrative. Unprecedented moment tonight at the CNN debate. a devastating blow to the vice president's credibility. Questions now swirl about Buttigieg's private dealings with foreign corporations. The headlines wrote themselves, but the fury, the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal spreading through living rooms, union halls, and diner counters across the country was something no script could contain. And then, almost as if some invisible dam had burst, the voices of ordinary Americans began to fill the airwaves and social feeds. Clips emerged, raw, unpolished, recorded on smartphones that shook slightly with emotion. A steelworker from Ohio, eyes red-rimmed but steady, spoke directly into his phone, his voice trembling with the weight of bitter experience. "I watched tonight, and I heard the promises, and then I heard that recording. And I want to know, when do we stop getting lied to? When does our work mean more than some deal behind closed doors?" His video spread like wildfire, shared by thousands in hours, then millions. A mother in Pennsylvania posted next, cradling a framed photo of her husband in his work uniform. The uniform he'd worn until his factory closed and the jobs left for cheaper labor overseas. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Pete Buttigieg said tonight he'd protect families like mine. But that recording, that sounded just like the men who shut my husband's plant down. Just like them." Viewers heard the pain beneath her words, and many felt it as their own. Town after town, voice after voice, the anger built, mingled with sorrow, and became impossible to ignore. Talk radio lines lit up. Comment sections overflowed. Hashtags trended with lightning speed. Hashtag truth on stage. Hashtag outsource promises. Hashtag who do they serve? Each carried with it not just outrage, but a plea for answers, for accountability, for something more honest than what the night had begun with. Pete's team scrambled to respond, issuing statements meant to soften the blow, to reframe, to explain. But every carefully crafted sentence seemed to dissolve under the weight of what people had seen and heard for themselves. The recording had done what no political attack, ad, or debate singer could have. It pierced through the armor of spin and left Pete's credibility exposed and bleeding. By dawn, the conversation had shifted. Pete was no longer the man with the plan for American renewal. He was the man who had been caught saying one thing to voters and another behind closed doors. And as the sun rose over a nation still buzzing with the night's events, one truth remained. The outrage was real, and it was not going away. The story had slipped beyond the control of any campaign. The people had seized it now, and what came next would be shaped as much by their voices as by anything Pete or JD might say. The storm JD had unleashed was now fully in the hands of the country he had spoken for. As public outrage flared across the nation, a different storm replayed itself in Pete Buttigieg's mind, a storm that had begun long before the debate, behind doors that the public was never meant to see past. The night air outside the studio brought no relief. Instead, it seemed to carry him backward, to the meeting that now haunted him, the moment where good intentions and hard realities collided and left him standing in the wreckage. It had been a private suite high above the city skyline, the kind of place where deals were struck far from cameras and microphones. The polished wood table gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, its lights glittering like promises. Around that table sat Pete and 3 foreign corporate executives, men whose names never appeared in headlines, whose influence shaped economies quietly, invisibly. Their suits were immaculate, their smiles polite but guarded, their eyes sharp and calculating. The air smelled faintly of leather and expensive whiskey. Pete had come into that room convinced he could find a middle ground. He'd believed with the same certainty that fueled his speeches that he could protect American workers while navigating the pressures of global economics. But as the conversation unfolded, that certainty began to erode. The executives spoke in measured tones, presenting charts and projections, their voices calm as they outlined efficiencies, cost savings, partnerships that could, on paper, look like progress. "We're offering a pathway, Mr. Vice President," one had said, tapping a page in the presentation. "These measures would allow you to claim record domestic investment while securing essential international cooperation. It's the kind of win-win your administration needs right now." Pete had nodded, at least outwardly. But inside, unease churned. Every data point came with an asterisk he couldn't ignore. For every promise of American job growth, there was a quiet mention of restructuring. For every new facility stateside, there was talk of complementary operations abroad. And buried in the language of opportunity was the truth. Jobs would leave, slowly enough to avoid immediate headlines, but steadily enough to hollow out communities that had already borne too much loss. He had pushed back at first. He remembered the tension in his own voice as he questioned the timelines, the safeguards, the real cost. But the replies had been smooth, practiced. They spoke of political capital, of economic realities, of the danger of falling behind in a global race. They reminded him of the election looming on the horizon, the need for wins, for partnerships, for headlines that soothed rather than stirred up anger. And in that room, with those voices pressing in from all sides, Pete had felt the weight of compromise settle on his shoulders. He told himself it was necessary, strategic, the only way to balance what could be done with what had to be done. But as he agreed to the broad strokes of the plan, a part of him recoiled. The part that still heard the voices of workers he'd met on factory floors, that remembered promises he'd made in town halls, that carried the hope of people who had believed in him. Now, as the fury of the nation grew louder, Pete saw that night for what it was, not a victory of pragmatism, but the moment the shadows had begun to claim him. And as the memory faded, the shame remained, sharper than ever. While Pete wrestled with the memory of that fateful meeting and the shadows it had cast over his conscience, J.D. Vance moved in a different kind of darkness, the shadowy corridors of power that now stirred to silence him. The storm J.D. had unleashed had not gone unnoticed by those who thrived behind closed doors, and as the public's anger flared hotter, the invisible forces he had challenged began to tighten their grip. J.D. had never been naive about what he was stepping into. Even before the debate, as he gathered the evidence that would shake the nation, he'd felt the quiet tremors of resistance. But now, in the aftermath of the revelation, those tremors had become something sharper, more deliberate. The first sign came hours after he left the studio, when his phone buzzed with a message that was pointed in its simplicity. Tread carefully. Some truths cost too much. There was no signature, no number he recognized. Just the words cold on the screen, like a breath of ice against the heat of his convictions. He deleted the message but felt its weight long after. The next day, as he worked with his team to sift through additional documents, calls began to come in. Old colleagues, political contacts, even distant acquaintances he hadn't heard from in years. Their voices were polite, almost friendly, but beneath the surface ran a current of warning. This isn't the fight you want, JD. There are bigger games at play here. Think about the future. You've made your point. Don't push it further. Each call ended the same way. An offer to meet, to talk, to find a path that avoided mutual harm. And with each call, JD felt the walls close in a little tighter. He wasn't surprised. He'd grown up knowing how power protected itself, how systems shielded the comfortable at the expense of the forgotten. But knowing didn't make the reality any less chilling. These weren't threats of violence, not yet, but they were threats all the same. Threats to his career, his relationships, his reputation. The soft kind of coercion that tried to dress itself as concern. And still, he kept digging. In a dim office lit by the glow of computer screens, JD and his closest advisors pored over emails, contracts, communications that hinted at the wider web surrounding Pete's deals. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the storm JD had started, but also added risk. The corporations involved weren't just foreign entities looking for a profit. They were tied to lobbyists, donors, and domestic players with deep roots and long memories. JD's every move now rippled through circles he'd long known existed but had rarely confronted so directly. The tension built with every passing hour. Doors that had once been open to him now closed without explanation. Allies hesitated, looking for cover. And yet JD pressed on, driven by something larger than politics, larger than personal safety. He thought of the families he'd met, the promises he'd made, not in speeches but in quiet conversations, in handshakes that carried the weight of hope. He thought of the night's silence, when the noise died down and all that was left was conscience. As the resistance grew, so did his resolve. The forces he'd stirred wanted him to stop, but stopping, JD knew, was no longer an option. Not if he meant to honor the truth he'd dared to bring into the light. As JD Vance pressed deeper into his search for truth, facing resistance that grew more pointed by the hour, another struggle unfolded behind closed doors, one far quieter but no less consuming. Pete Buttigieg sat alone in the dimness of his private residence, the glow of the city beyond his window doing nothing to ease the weight that pressed down on him. The night outside was still, but inside his mind refused to rest. Every attempt to close his eyes only replayed the debate stage, the recording, the shock on faces he'd hoped to inspire. The words he'd spoken in that private meeting, the ones he'd convinced himself were necessary compromises, echoed louder now in the silence. He ran a hand through his hair, weary beyond measure, but sleep would not come. Instead, memory played its relentless reel. He saw the steelworker's video, the mother with the framed photo, the headlines that now defined him not as a builder of hope, but as a man who had betrayed it. Guilt gnawed at the edges of his composure, sharp and relentless. He had thought he could manage the balance, that the cost of certain deals could be hidden beneath layers of good intentions. But now, stripped bare by truth, he saw those justifications for what they were, illusions meant to quiet his own doubts. Far from that sleepless room, J.D. Vance found no rest either, but his night took him to a different kind of reckoning. The weight he carried drove him into the heart of the communities he'd long vowed to serve. Long after cameras had packed up and headlines had been written, he walked the quiet streets of towns hollowed out by the very forces he'd called out. The hum of a lone streetlight, the shuttered storefronts, the silence where factories once roared with life. All of it reminded him why he could not, would not back down. He stopped in front of an old mill, its gates rusted, its windows dark. He remembered the last time he'd been there, remembered the workers who'd greeted him with cautious hope, remembered the pride in their voices when they spoke of what their labor had built. Now only echoes remained. J.D. felt the chill of the night seep into his bones, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the enormity of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a debate or a news cycle. It was about the future of towns like this, about families who'd given everything and been left with nothing. Elsewhere, Pete stared at his reflection, haunted by what he saw. A man who had meant to do good, but who now struggled to recognize the face looking back at him. And as he wrestled with regret, J.D. stood in the emptiness of a forgotten street, more resolved than ever to see this fight through, no matter the cost. Their struggles ran parallel, two men bound by a moment that had forever altered their course. The night deepened around them, but both knew the dawn would bring no easy answers. Only more questions, more reckonings and choices that would shape what came next, for themselves and for the country watching, waiting, and hoping for truth that would not fail them again. The night that had carried J.D. Vance through empty streets and past shuttered mills gave way to a gray, quiet dawn. But instead of returning home or retreating to the comfort of an office, J.D. kept going. The weight of the stories he'd carried in his heart for so long, stories of jobs lost, promises broken, dreams deferred, compelled him forward. He knew that headlines and sound bites would fade, but what endured were the lives shaped by decisions made far from view. And so, as morning broke, J.D. found himself seated at a battered table in a union hall that had seen better days, surrounded by faces lined not just by years, but by disappointment and resolve. The hall smelled faintly of old coffee and machine oil, a scent that spoke of long hours and hard labor. Around him sat men and women who had built the bones of this nation: steel workers, machinists, welders, truck drivers. People who had worked with their hands, their backs, their hearts, and one by one, they began to speak. A man named Rick, his flannel shirt faded from countless washes, leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low but steady. "I gave 30 years to that plant," he said, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond J.D.'s shoulder, as if staring back at what had been. "Didn't miss a shift unless I was too sick to stand. And when they shut it down, they didn't even give us a week's notice. Just a meeting, a handshake, and good luck." His hands, rough and scarred, gripped a coffee cup as if it were the last solid thing left in a world that had shifted beneath him. Beside him, Maria, a mother of two, shared her story with quiet dignity that somehow made the pain sharper. My husband and I both worked at the warehouse. When it closed, we lost our health insurance overnight. I've got a son who needs treatments, and every day I'm on the phone, begging someone to help us keep the coverage we have left. Her voice wavered at the edges, but she didn't cry. She'd shed those tears long ago. Now what remained was a kind of steel, forged in the fires of necessity. Others spoke, some with anger, some with sadness, all with the raw honesty that came from having nothing left to lose. JD listened, not as a politician gathering talking points, but as a man who understood, who felt the weight of every word settle onto his conscience. The room, small and worn, felt like the beating heart of the very America so often invoked on the stages and in speeches, yet too often ignored when the cameras turned away. As the stories unfolded, JD felt the enormity of his task grow clearer. This wasn't just about exposing deals or winning debates. It was about restoring faith where it had been shattered, about making sure that promises meant something again. The pain in that room wasn't abstract. It was immediate, human, and it demanded more than sympathy. It demanded action. And as the voices of pain filled the space, JD made a silent vow that he would not let these stories be reduced to headlines or forgotten in the next news cycle. He would carry them forward, let them guide his every word, his every choice. Because in those voices he heard not just the toll of what had been lost, but the hope, fragile but unbroken, for what might still be reclaimed. While J.D. Vance sat among workers who bore the scars of broken promises, Pete Buttigieg found himself unable to escape the weight of their stories. He had seen the videos, heard the voices, felt the sting of their words echo in news clips and across social feeds. But no broadcast, no commentary, no headline could compare to standing in the places those voices called home. And so, as the public storm raged and his team argued over strategies and statements, Pete made a choice few would have expected. He left the safe confines of his office, of the polished rooms where damage was managed, and set out alone to see for himself what his decisions had wrought. He drove with no fanfare, no entourage, no cameras, only the steady hum of the engine and the relentless ache of conscience for company. The towns he visited were not unfamiliar in name, places he had toured during campaign stops, places he had once spoken of with pride as symbols of resilience. But now, as he moved through them quietly, anonymously, they felt transformed. Or perhaps it was he who had changed, forced at last to see what had always been there beyond the speeches and handshakes. The first stop was a small main street lined with buildings that seemed to lean against one another, as if weariness had made even the bricks and mortar seek support. Storefronts once bright with signs and displays now stood hollow, windows streaked with dust and grime. A grocery store he vaguely remembered visiting on a campaign stop was shuttered, a faded for lease sign hanging crooked in the window. A playground nearby sat empty, its swings still in the cold morning air, as if waiting for laughter that no longer came. Pete parked and walked, hands deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against more than the chill. He passed a diner where two older men sat at a window booth, their eyes following him with the wary curiosity reserved for strangers in places that had grown used to being overlooked. He nodded once, offered a tight smile that wasn't returned. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't have smiled either. Further down the street, he paused before a factory gate, rusted and chained. The nameplate above it, once polished steel, proud and bold, was dulled now, letters pitted with age. He stood there for a long time, remembering the day he had praised this very plant in a speech about American industry's future. He had spoken then of innovation, of competitiveness, of the need to adapt. Now all he saw was the hollow shell of promises unmet. A voice behind him broke the stillness. A woman, perhaps in her 50s, wearing a coat that had seen too many winters, spoke without malice but with quiet finality. "Used to be 100 families fed by that plant," she said. "Now the kids move away, and the rest of us just try to hang on." Pete turned, wanting to say something, anything, but found no words that wouldn't ring hollow. So he simply nodded, and in that moment, felt the weight of his choices more acutely than any debate, any headline, any accusation could have made him feel. As he walked back to his car, the voices of pain JD had heard the day before seemed to echo in his ears. And with each step, Pete understood. The consequences of his decisions weren't abstractions on a balance sheet. They were here, in the silent streets, the shuttered stores, the eyes of those left behind. And there was no speech that could undo what had been done. The silent streets, the hollow factories, the eyes of strangers that spoke volumes without a word. Pete Buttigieg carried those images with him as he entered the town hall that night. He had agreed to come, against the advice of his team, who feared what awaited him. But Pete knew there was no hiding from it anymore. He had walked those streets, seen what remained in the wake of choices made in rooms like the one he now stepped into. If there was fury to face, he would face it. The hall was modest, its folding chairs filled, its walls lined with residents who couldn't find a seat but refused to be left outside. There was no applause when Pete entered, no welcome, just the thick, tense quiet of a community ready to speak its mind. Pete took the microphone, his hands betraying a faint tremor he tried to will away. He opened his mouth to begin, but before the first full sentence could form, the dam broke. A man near the front, face weathered, voice rough with emotion, rose to his feet. "You came here before, said you'd fight for us," he said, voice steady but loud enough to fill the room. "Said no one would be left behind. Was that just words? Did you already know what deals you'd make when you shook our hands?" The question landed like a blow. Pete tried to respond, but another voice joined in. A woman cradling a toddler on her hip, her eyes blazing. "My husband hasn't worked steady in 2 years because of the plant closure. We listened to you. We believed you. And now we're supposed to do what? Wait for another promise?" The tension in the room rose, voices layering over one another. Not chaotic, but insistent, unstoppable. "How do we trust anything you say now?" someone demanded from the back. "You sold us out," another shouted. The faces blurred for Pete as the accusations poured over him, each voice a reminder of the trust that had been broken, each question and one he could not answer without feeling the sting of truth in it. He raised his hands, tried to plead for order, for a chance to speak, but the room was past waiting. The hurt, the betrayal, the exhaustion of people who had carried too much for too long surged forward in their words. Pete felt it press against him, not physically, but with a force just as real, the weight of anger justified, of disappointment earned. Finally, the room fell into a brief, expectant hush, as if daring him to speak, to find the right words. But the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened, his chest ached with the effort of holding back the storm within. His voice, when it emerged, was hoarse, uneven. "I thought I could balance it. I thought I could protect what mattered and still do what had to be done. I see now. I see I was wrong." And with that, the composure he had fought so hard to maintain broke. His eyes burned, and for a moment, Pete looked less like a polished politician and more like a man laid bare by his own choices. The room watched in heavy silence as Pete's shoulders slumped. The weight of the night, and all that had led to it, finally too much to bear. In that moment, there were no slogans, no promises left, only the raw, painful truth of what had been lost. And in that truth, the future hung in the balance, waiting for what would come next. As the echoes of the town hall's raw motion lingered in the air, far from that room, J.D. Vance found himself stepping deeper into a storm of a different kind. The fury Pete Buttigieg had faced from betrayed citizens was public, loud, and visible. But the storm now gathering around J.D. was quieter, more insidious, and no less dangerous. The forces that profited from silence, that thrived in the shadows behind closed deals and hidden compromises, had begun to close ranks, and J.D. was squarely in their sights. It started subtly, the kind of subtlety that spoke of practiced hands. His phone rang in the early morning hours, an unknown number flashing against the dark. When he answered, the voice on the other end was calm, almost gentle. "You've made your point," the voice said. "There's no need to take this further. There are other ways to serve the people you claim to care about. Walk away, J.D., for your sake and for theirs." The line went dead before JD could respond, leaving only the hollow sound of the dial tone in his ear and the pounding of his heart in his chest. But that was only the beginning. Throughout the day, the pressure mounted. Anonymous messages arrived, some implied, some direct. Notes slid under the door of his office, emails with no sender, letters with no return address. There's no winning this fight. You're risking more than your career. Think of your family, Vance. And though no single message crossed the line into outright threat, the accumulation was clear. Back down, or the cost would rise. JD read each one, felt the chill each carried, but refused to let fear take hold. He had grown up seeing what fear did to good people, how it made them small, how it kept them silent when they should have spoken. He would not let it do the same to him. If anything, the rising pressure only strengthened his resolve. With every warning, he thought of the voices he'd heard in union halls, of the empty factories he'd passed, of the children whose futures had been bartered away in quiet meetings far from their sight. He met with his team in hushed rooms, aware now that even walls might have ears. The danger was real, but so was the mission. And when one of his aides, eyes wide with worry, urged him to consider stepping back, to let others carry the charge, JD shook his head. "We don't get to walk away from this," he said quietly. "Not now. Not when the truth's finally out there. That's what they're counting on. That we'll get scared, that we'll fold. But we don't serve them. We serve the people who can't fight this fight themselves." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that steadies those around you, that reminds them why they stood beside you in the first place. And as the day drew on and the threats kept coming, JD stood firm, a man tested but unshaken, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to back down, no matter how dark the night becomes. While JD Vance braced himself against mounting threats, standing firm in the face of unseen pressures, Pete Buttigieg made a desperate bid to regain control of the narrative, slipping rapidly from his grasp. The town hall had left him raw, exposed, and the outpouring of public anger had only intensified in the days since. His advisors insisted that action was needed, a decisive, visible gesture to stem the tide of outrage. And so, under the harsh glare of television lights and the unblinking eyes of a nation, Pete stepped behind the podium for a live press conference that, he hoped, would stop the bleeding. He began with the measured calm of a man trying to steady a ship already taking on water. His voice, though tight with fatigue, sought to project strength. "I want to speak directly to the American people," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "I've heard your concerns. I've listened to the voices of those impacted by economic decisions, and I take full responsibility for the trust that has been shaken." It was the language of accountability, crafted with care, designed to reassure. But even as the words left his mouth, the cracks in the plan began to show. The reporters in the room, their pens poised and cameras focused, were no longer content with polished statements. The questions came fast, pointed, relentless. "Mr. Vice President, can you explain the details of the offshore agreements mentioned in the latest leak? Were you aware of the tax shelter strategies tied to your infrastructure partners? How do you respond to the documents released this morning indicating further outsourcing plans?" Pete faltered, his rehearsed answers unable to keep pace with the speed of new revelations. Because even as he spoke, new leaks were surfacing. Emails, contracts, memos that painted an even grimmer picture than the recording that had ignited the firestorm. The timing was brutal, the effect devastating. The carefully staged event meant to restore confidence now served as the stage for his further unraveling. Across television screens and social media feeds, the press conference played out not as an act of leadership, but as a spectacle of a man overwhelmed. Viewers watched as Pete's polished image cracked under the strain of questions he couldn't answer, as his attempts to pivot fell flat, as his assurances rang hollow against the weight of fresh evidence. The hashtags that had simmered in the days before now exploded in renewed fury. Hashtag more than one deal, hashtag truth matters, hashtag no more excuses. The backlash swelled with every passing minute, the tide of public opinion turning from disappointment to something harsher. Betrayal, anger, disbelief. Pete saw it in the faces of the journalists before him, heard it in the murmur that grew louder with each stammered reply. And though he pushed through to the end, delivering the closing lines his team had written, lines meant to inspire, to signal resolve, they fell flat, lost in the storm of disbelief that now surrounded him. As he stepped away from the podium, the applause that might once have followed was absent. In its place was a silence heavy with judgment, a silence that echoed across the country. Pete had come to the stage seeking to control the damage, but the damage had outpaced him, spiraling into something no speech could mend. And as the cameras cut away, the truth was stark. The nation no longer waited for his explanations. It waited for accountability. The press conference had been meant as a lifeline, a final attempt to steady a ship battered by storms of its own making. But as Pete Buttigieg stepped away from the podium, heart pounding, the reality settled over him like lead. The questions had not stopped. The cameras had not blinked. The silence in the room after his closing words was not the respectful pause of a nation listening. It was the heavy quiet of a verdict already decided. And in that moment, something inside Pete began to fray beyond repair. Even as aides tried to usher him from the stage, reporters pressed forward, their voices rising with urgency, with heat. "Do you deny the authenticity of the new documents?" one called out. "Is this the leadership you promised American workers?" demanded another. The questions came like waves, and Pete, instead of retreating, turned back, his face flushed, his eyes bright with the mix of exhaustion, anger, and despair that he could no longer contain. "I have given everything I have to this country." Pete's voice rang out, sharper, louder than he intended, filling the space with raw emotion. His hands gripped the sides of the podium as if to steady himself against the force of his own words. "You think this is easy, balancing what's right, what's possible, what keeps us moving forward? You sit there with your questions and your judgments, but none of you has had to sit in that chair to make those calls." The room froze, the tension thick as steel cables. The polished statesman was gone. In his place stood a man unraveling under the weight of what had been lost. Pete's breath came fast now, his chest rising and falling as he tried to gather himself. But the words kept coming, fueled by frustration, by hurt, by the sting of betrayal, not just of the public's trust, but of his own hopes for what he had tried to build. "I didn't set out to fail you," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "I didn't set out to be the villain in your headlines. I tried. I tried to find a way to save jobs, to save communities, to keep this country strong. But no one wants to hear that. You want a monster? You want someone to blame? Fine. Here I am." The cameras caught every word, every tremor in his voice, every flicker of pain in his eyes. And across the nation, viewers watched in stunned silence as a man once seen as composed, capable, collapsed under the public gaze. The room remained still for a breathless beat, the weight of his outburst hanging heavy. Then, without waiting for another question, without waiting for permission or guidance, Pete stepped back from the podium, his face flushed with anger and shame. He turned sharply, his footsteps echoing in the silent hall as he stormed off the stage, leaving behind a room too shocked to speak. The moment played out across screens, shared and replayed within minutes, dissected and debated in real time. But beneath the noise, beneath the spin, one truth was clear. The man who had come to defend himself had instead laid himself bare. And in doing so, he had left the nation not with answers, but with the haunting image of a leader undone. In the wake of Pete Buttigieg's public breakdown, as the nation tried to make sense of what it had witnessed, J.D. Vance stepped forward, not as a man eager to claim victory, but as one who understood the weight of the moment. The cameras that had captured Pete's anguish now turned to J.D., seeking the voice that had sparked this reckoning. And when J.D. spoke, it was not with triumph or scorn, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew the fight was bigger than any one man. He stood behind a simple lectern, the backdrop plain, the message unadorned. No banners, no slogans, just J.D. and the truth as he saw it. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying not just through the broadcast but into the hearts of those watching. Workers in quiet homes, families gathered around kitchen tables, towns still reeling from loss. "Tonight," J.D. began, his eyes meeting the lens as if addressing each viewer personally, I want to speak not about politics, but about something deeper, about what binds us, about what we owe to one another, about the America we believe in, even when it disappoints us. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We've seen anger. We've seen heartbreak. We've seen what happens when promises are broken and trust is betrayed, and we have every right to be angry. But if all we do is stay angry, if all we do is tear down, we'll lose something even greater, the chance to rebuild together. JD's speech wasn't polished to perfection. It didn't sound like it had been drafted in a war room or run through focus groups. It sounded real, the kind of honesty that didn't come wrapped in applause lines. He spoke of integrity, not as a slogan, but as a duty. It's easy to tell people what they want to hear. It's harder to tell the truth, especially when it costs you something. But that's what leadership is. That's what public service is supposed to be. And that's what I promise to you. Honesty, even when it's hard. Transparency, even when it's uncomfortable. And unity, not just as a word, but as a call to action. His words traveled far that night, cutting through the noise of spin and scandal. Viewers who had grown cynical leaned closer, hearing not perfection, but purpose. JD didn't promise easy answers. He didn't offer quick fixes. Instead, he invited the nation to stand with him, to demand better, to be better. We don't rescue our future by tearing one another down, he said, his voice warming with conviction. We do it by lifting each other up, by holding ourselves accountable, and by standing together for what's right. As JD concluded, there was no cheering crowd, no orchestrated applause, just a moment of quiet that felt somehow fuller than sound. Across the country, people nodded, some with tears in their eyes, not because all was fixed, but because for the first time in a long time, they felt seen. JD hadn't just spoken of unity, he had offered it, and in doing so, had reminded a fractured nation what it could still be. JD Vance's call for unity echoed across the nation, offering hope where only anger and confusion had reigned. But for Pete Buttigieg, those words reached him like a reminder of all he felt he had failed to live up to. Long after the cameras had gone dark, after the headlines had dissected every word of his collapse, Pete sat alone in a quiet room, blinds drawn against the outside world. The stillness was deafening, filled only by the hum of the city beyond, a city that no longer felt like his to serve. The weight of resignation pressed heavy on his chest. He turned the idea over in his mind, again and again, like a stone too rough to hold, but too significant to set down. Could stepping aside be an act of accountability? Or would it be seen as retreat, as weakness? The questions circled him like vultures, relentless and unanswerable. His advisors gathered at his request that night, not as strategists or handlers, but as the few voices he still trusted to speak hard truths. The room was dimly lit, the mood heavy. Pete didn't stand at the head of the table. He sat among them, shoulders bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. It was a posture they had never seen from him before, and it spoke volumes before he said a word. I don't know if I can come back from this, Pete confessed at last, his voice low but steady. I don't know if I should. For a long moment, no one responded. Then his senior aide, a woman who had stood by him through victories and defeats alike, spoke quietly. Pete, no one questions that you meant well, but this isn't about what you intended anymore. It's about what people need from you now. He met her gaze, searching for judgment and finding only concern. And what is that? What do they need from me? His words trembled with exhaustion, with the raw vulnerability of a man laid bare. Truth, she said simply, and a path forward, whether you lead it or not. Another advisor shifted in his seat, leaning forward. If you resign, it needs to be for the right reason, not to escape this, but to own it, to show that integrity still matters. Pete let their words wash over him, absorbing the honesty that no statement or spin could offer. He thought of JD's speech, of the unity it had inspired, of the leadership it represented. Could he match that courage by stepping down? Or was there another way to serve, to repair the trust that had shattered beneath him? I've spent my career trying to build something good, Pete said, his voice thick with emotion. And in trying to hold it all together, I let the cracks form where I should have stood stronger. I see that now. I don't want to be the reason people lose faith in what public service should be. The room fell quiet again, heavy with the gravity of what lay before him. Pete stared at his hands, at the lines that seemed deeper now, at the choices they had made. And as dawn crept toward the horizon, he remained at that crossroads, between stepping away and stepping up, between regret and redemption, knowing that whichever path he chose, it would define him forever. As Pete Buttigieg stood at the crossroads of his future, grappling with regret and searching for a path toward redemption, the nation's attention shifted. The media, once consumed with Pete's unraveling, turned its focus to J.D. Vance, the figure who, without theatrics or self-congratulation, had sparked the reckoning that now gripped the country. News outlets ran headlines praising his restraint, his sincerity, and above all, his humility. J.D. Vance, the voice of conscience America needed, declared one prominent network. Leadership without ego, read another. Talk shows debated not his strategy, but his integrity. The narrative had changed, and J.D. stood at its center, not as a hero by design, but as one forged by necessity. But J.D. didn't bask in the praise. He didn't see himself as a champion. If anything, the accolades made him more aware of the weight he now carried. Alone in his office, the noise of applause and commentary felt distant, almost unreal. He stared out the window at a city waking to a new day, and all he could think of was the responsibility that day would bring. The headlines would fade, as they always did. What mattered was what came next, what he would do with the trust so many had suddenly placed in him. He thought of the families who had spoken at town halls and rallies, of workers who had lost not just jobs but identities, of children growing up in communities forgotten by the powerful. Their faces, their voices stayed with him, grounding him in purpose. J.D. knew the danger of this moment, the temptation to believe the praise, to let it soften resolve, to mistake recognition for result. He would not fall into that trap. The people who had leaned on his words deserved more than promises. They deserved action, sacrifice, and honesty that lasted beyond the news cycle. In the quiet of that morning, J.D. made a silent vow to stay humble, to stay focused, to measure his success not by headlines or approval ratings, but by the real, lasting good he could help bring about. The media might call him a champion, but he saw himself as a servant of those who had waited too long for someone to truly hear them. And as the sun rose higher, casting light over the city and the challenges ahead, J.D. felt the steadying clarity of purpose that had guided him from the start. The spotlight might have found him, but it would not change him. The work was only beginning, and he would meet it with the same quiet resolve that had brought him here. Not for glory, but for the people who needed him to stand strong. Pete Buttigieg stepped into the spotlight once more, but this time the air was different. Gone was the polish of campaign sheen, the carefully managed confidence that had once defined his public presence. Now what stood before the nation was a man stripped bare by consequence, humbled by failure, and determined, at last, to speak without defense, without spin. The hall was full, the cameras rolled, but there was no grand entrance, no triumphant music. Just Pete, the weight of recent days visible in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the pause he took before he began. "I came here tonight," Pete said, voice quiet at first, "not to ask for forgiveness, not to salvage a title or a position, but because I owe you the truth." The hall was silent, listening. He drew a breath, steadying himself against the enormity of what he needed to say. "I made decisions I thought were pragmatic, decisions I believed would balance progress with reality. But in doing so, I lost sight of the very people I promised to protect. I let ambition cloud judgment, and in trying to serve the future, I betrayed the present." The words came slowly, but with a clarity that reached beyond the cameras to living rooms, kitchens, factory break rooms across the country. Pete's remorse wasn't performative, it was genuine, shaped by sleepless nights and the hard mirror of public disappointment. "I see now," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "that good intentions don't excuse harmful outcomes. That compromises made in back rooms leave scars on communities, on families, on trust itself. And for that, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. He spoke not as a man seeking redemption through applause, but as one seeking to start the long road back to integrity. He named the towns he had failed, the promises that had gone unkept, the faces that haunted his memory, the mother at the town hall, the steelworker, the children of shuttered communities. And as he did, a quiet shift began. Those listening, many still angry, found that anger softened, not erased but tempered by the courage it took to stand there and admit wrong so publicly, so fully. "I cannot undo the harm," Pete said, emotion thick in his throat, "but I can, and I will spend whatever time I have left in public service working to repair what I broke, to lift what I let fall. Not as a vice president, but as a citizen, as a neighbor, as someone who failed and wants to do better." As he stepped away from the podium, there was no applause, no cheers, just a deep, collective breath. The healing had begun. In the days that followed, as the nation digested Pete's words, J.D. Vance took to the stage, not to claim victory, but to lay out a vision that moved beyond division, beyond exposure of failure, toward the building of something stronger. He stood before a crowd in a factory town once vibrant, now battered, and spoke with a passion that matched the moment. "This is not about tearing down," J.D. began, his voice clear, his presence steady. "It's about building up. It's about making sure that American jobs, American families, and American communities are never again treated as bargaining chips in some backroom deal." J.D.'s plan wasn't just rhetoric. He outlined investments in manufacturing, protections for domestic workers, incentives for small businesses, and penalties for corporations that abandoned American soil for short-term profit. He called for transparency measures that would make deals like the ones that had cost so many their livelihoods impossible to hide. His words were not lofty promises, but concrete steps, steps that made the crowd lean forward, eyes bright, hope rekindled. And as he spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been only disillusionment, now there was purpose. J.D.'s vision was not just of restored jobs, but of restored dignity. "We will not stand by while towns wither," he declared. "We will not accept a future built on the loss of our neighbors, our friends, our own children's prospects. This is our time to reclaim what's been lost, not through anger alone, but through action, through unity, through courage." The energy was electric, contagious, spreading beyond the rally to communities across the country. People who had felt invisible saw themselves in his words, saw a place for themselves in the work ahead. J.D. didn't promise that it would be easy. He promised it would be worth it. The culmination came at a community rally that drew citizens from miles around, a gathering not of spectacle, but of shared purpose. J.D. stood before them, no teleprompter, no script, just the truth as he saw it, and the faith he placed in those before him. "We are not here tonight because of one man's failure," he said, voice strong in the crisp evening air. "We are here because we believe in something bigger. We believe in honesty, not the easy kind that comes when it costs nothing, but the hard kind that shows up when it matters most. We believe in courage, not in standing alone, but in standing together. And we believe in action, not tomorrow, not next year, but now." He spoke of communities rebuilding, of hands joining not in blame but in work. He spoke of the power of ordinary people to reclaim the promise of their country. And as he did, something remarkable happened. The crowd fell silent, not with indifference but with a reverence for the moment, for the shared understanding that they stood at a beginning, not an end. J.D.'s final words carried on the wind that night, simple and profound. "America's future will not be written behind closed doors. It will be written here, by us, in the open light of day, and together we will make it worthy of our children's dreams." The rally ended not with fanfare, but with a quiet determination, a sense that hope, long deferred, had found its way home at last. The dawn had come, not through noise or spectacle, but through truth, courage, and the promise of what comes when a nation chooses to stand together. This story reminds us that true leadership is not about perfection, but about owning our mistakes and striving to do better. J.D.'s courage and Pete's humility show that redemption and unity are possible when we choose honesty over ego. It's a call to act with integrity. What do you believe matters most in rebuilding trust? Words, actions, or both? Let's reflect together. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.